The recent release of the so-called palace letters from previously classified government records has renewed interest in an Australian republic, with an Australian head of state instead of a British Queen or King. They detailed apparently salacious dealings between the Australian Governor-General John Kerr and the Queen's representative in Buckingham Palace at the time of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's dismissal in 1975. But while Whitlam fanatics like historian Jenny Hocking and populist politicians like Labor's Mark Dreyfus claim the letters prove beyond doubt that the Queen herself was in on it, the reality is far less interesting. The letters highlight the fact that Kerr had been communicating with the palace on what constitutionally proper actions could be taken in a situation where the government couldn't get its own budget supply bills passed. Her Majesty's Secretary detailing possible actions the Governor-General could take in this situation isn't quite the same as the Queen herself interfering in Australian democracy and telling the Governor-General to sack the PM. Although without an Australian head of state, this will forever remain a possibility, however remote. At best, the letters confirm that John Kerr acted to sack the government and dissolve both houses of Parliament before informing the Queen, because had the Queen known about his plans, she would have had to inform Whitlam, and Whitlam would obviously have sacked the Governor-General. The selfish act of someone as interested in looking after his own job as he was the rest of the country? Yeah, pretty much. It was a circular game of parliamentary chicken, the sort of highfalutin politics we excel at here in Australia. What these letters have done is reignite interest in an Australian republic. We last held a referendum on the subject back in '99, with every state and territory rejecting the idea, except for the ACT. Imagine my shock. Voter demographics make clear that the idea also really only had support in the inner cities. A younger Malcolm Turnbull led the campaign for a republic, but like pretty much everything he did as Prime Minister, he failed to bring the rest of the country or even his own party along with him, later accusing John Howard of breaking the nation's heart by selecting a dud governance model for the referendum question. Now, as a staunch monarchist, Howard ensured the failure of that referendum by selecting the most unpopular Republican model available, one where our president would be little more than a figurehead selected by the parliamentary party in government, i.e. him. The few polls that exist on the subject suggest that the only model likely to succeed is one where the people directly elect their president. Now that leaves a lot of balls up in the air, such as whether the executive would sit in Parliament or be appointed by the president in a truer separation of powers, but these are details that can't really be sorted out until after the fundamental question has been answered. Now, I've supported an Australian republic for as long as I've been paying attention to politics, and that position has only ever been reinforced by monarchist British-born politicians like Tony Abbott, who want to send our most prestigious cultural awards back home to the motherland. But I wouldn't support it at the expense of governance and election models that, until now at least, have served us very well. There's a reason we have proportional representation in a Senate that has an equal number of representatives for each state. It just so happens to be the same reason the United States has an electoral college in between the voters and the president. That reason is called the tyranny of the majority, a side effect of purely democratic systems that utterly fail to serve the needs of culturally important but less populous parts of the country. If the US didn't have an electoral college, which essentially combines the population-based MPs in the lower house with the fixed and equal number of senators in the upper house, every presidential election would be decided by California and New York. Now, I'm sure most Democrats would argue that a pure democracy like this is the only fair way to go. Hillary certainly thought so. But even though the votes of country and city folk might be worth the same on paper, the city factions would have a permanent advantage over the country and rural folk by sheer weight of numbers. Hence, tyranny of the majority, and the states would no longer be united, as voters in states that aren't CA or NY would lose any and all influence over their American way of life. The country would essentially disintegrate. In Australia, thankfully, the urban-rural divide isn't so staunchly along party lines, although The right does have more sway in country areas by virtue of the National Party's long-standing coalition with the Liberal Party. But even here, in the last decade, there's been extensive debate on the usefulness of the Senate as a house of review, with single-issue state-centric senators holding up bills that fund and govern the entire nation unless they secure that extra 20 grand for their local hospital or highway. It affects both sides of politics too, with Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating once calling senators unrepresentative swill, and with senators like Jackie Lambie, Pauline Hanson, Darren Hinch and Clive Palmer, he's spot on, at least about the unrepresentative part. This is why Republican minimalists in Australia have the upper hand over those like me who support a president elected by the people. Without a complex mechanism like the Electoral College, people outside the more populous parts of the country would have little to no influence on the outcome, and that is definitely a bad thing. I'm sorry, fellow Hillary shills, but the popular vote alone is not, and really shouldn't ever be, the only determinant of a presidential election. The minimalists want a ceremonial head of state, put there by the PM and with no executive power whatsoever, in order to preserve the Westminster parliamentary system and what they call responsible government. The quaint notion that the executive is responsible to the parliament because ministers are simultaneously MPs. Well, we've got a state health minister who refused to answer a single question in one of the only parliamentary sessions this year, saying she'd take them all on notice and answer them in writing the next day.
Will you release the report today and stop the cover-up?
The minister had one reply.
I will be providing her with a written response to her question by tomorrow. As I said, I will be providing the member with a written response to this question. I will provide her with a written answer in accordance with the standing order. Refer to the reply to the previous question.
That next day, she wrote back to them and said she couldn't answer any of them because there was an inquiry underway, even though the judge running that inquiry had explicitly stated otherwise. We've got a federal aged care minister who, after days of prep time, couldn't even tell a parliamentary hearing how many Australians in aged care homes were sick and dying in the middle of a pandemic that targets the aged and infirm.
How many residents have passed away from COVID-19?
I'll just have to look up my latest report, Chair. That might take me a moment.
35 agonising seconds followed as Richard Colbeck scrambled, but no answer came.
Could an official help if the minister's not able to?
258 care recipients had passed away.
Minister, you weren't aware of that number?
I have got the details, I just couldn't find it. It's a hand, I'm sorry.
Labor's committee chair wasn't done.
Minister, how many residents have COVID-19 today?
Again, Senator, I don't have the report with the actual detail in front of me.
You don't know how many people have passed away. You're now telling me you don't know how many people have the infection.
Chair,
You're the Minister for Aged Care.
The PM claimed that numbers are hard, and other Liberals claimed that the question itself was out of line. Not fair. We've had not one single demand for parliamentary accountability at any level of government throughout this health and economic crisis. Not even a demand for better performance from these incompetent elites running the show. So whatever it is you're holding on to, I'm not seeing it. The idea of responsible government in Australia is a cruel joke, and Australians deserve more than a ceremonial head of state in order to preserve it.